my welcome, I highlighted the objectives of the course, but let's just run through them one more time. By the end of this introduction course, you will be able to create, enhance and print data in Excel, having followed the units listed below. We'll begin with an introduction to Excel, where you'll become familiarised with the Excel interface. Then we'll move on to creating a worksheet, which will include entering, editing and deleting data. The next step involves managing workbooks. That's saving our information, opening files and closing files. Once we've done that, we're able to look at working with calculations and some basic built-in functions that Excel provides for us. Having reached that point, we now want to make our spreadsheet look more professional, so we'll focus on Spreadsheet Presentation. This includes bold, italic, underline, but also applying borders, fill colours and number formatting. The next step involves rearranging data. So that's if we want to move data in our Excel spreadsheet or copy data. And then finally, we'll end with printing. That will involve us looking at our spreadsheet in Print Preview and making various changes. For example, changing the page orientation from portrait to landscape, so that we're then ready to print our data. So let's start with the introduction to Excel. This is broken down into the following 6 units. We're going to begin by looking at the Excel interface and getting you used to the screen and the different terminology for the different elements of the screen. Once we've looked at that, we'll then focus on moving around a worksheet and a workbook, which is something you will spend a lot of time doing. And in the same way, selecting data, that's also something we spend a lot of time doing in Excel, whether we want to format data, delete data, or move data. It's important that you select efficiently and correctly. That will then lead us on to looking at different views. There's several views available, different ways of looking at your data in Excel, and of course zooming in and out if you want to make things on your screen seem a bit bigger so they're easier for you to see. Not when it comes to printing, but just for viewing on the screen, we'll be able to use zoom. And then we'll finish off looking at some of the default options you can set within Excel, and finally using help. So without further ado, let's move on to the Excel interface. So you've turned your computer on, your desktop is in front of you. So how do we find Excel? How can we open Excel? Well, that will vary depending on the operating system you're using. One tip I would give you, however, is to look for a search box down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. It may sit to the left of your taskbar, as in the example here, or you may find that the search box sits just above the Start button, which you click in the bottom left-hand corner. Either way, when you locate the search box, the quickest way to launch Excel is to type Excel in the search box, and the list that appears reveals everything that it can find that contains the word Excel in. And what we're after is at the top of that list, Excel 2016. However, I am aware that some of you do not have search boxes. So for those of you, you may need to click your Start button in the bottom left-hand corner, or your Office button, your Windows button, as we've got here in this example. Now, I could scroll up and down this list, it's in alphabetical order, looking for Excel, so I'd need to go to the letter E. Or alternatively, I can click on one of the capital letters. In this example, I'm clicking on A, and then I click on E to locate Excel, and I can click on Excel 2016 to launch it. One other thing I do think it's prudent to point out at this point is that if you have got an much older version of Windows Office, you may need to click Start in the bottom left-hand corner, followed by Programs, followed by Microsoft Office, and there you will find Excel 2016. But once you've used it from there, it does add it to your Start menu, so you shouldn't have to repeat that process every time. So without further ado, let's launch Excel. So this is what welcomes us when the Excel screen appears. If we had been working on any files, we would see them appear here underneath the recent listing, but we haven't. So in a moment, we will click Open to go and open another workbook. if we wish to open one, of course. But it is really worth mentioning what you can see over here on the right hand side. If we want to start with a blank workbook, there's the option there. However, you may wish to take a tour of Excel, so you could use this example with one click in order to get a brief introduction to some of the features available in Excel. There are other templates available as well. I will talk more about these later on. So for example, if you need to do a cash flow analysis, or if you need to do something like a personal expenses calculator, why reinvent the wheel? If you want to do something like this, use one of these templates and you can just replace the data that's there with your data. But for now, we're going to look at what happens when we go into a blank workbook. So if I click once on blank workbook, here is our Excel screen. So at the very top of the screen, in what's called the title bar, it tells us the name of the product, hooray, it's Excel, and the name of the book that we've got open. At the moment it's book 1, it's a brand new book in a brand new session of Excel. To the top right hand corner, we have our close button. That will exit Excel, or the workbook if you have multiple books open. You also have the ability to make this screen medium sized by clicking once. The middle button is then replaced with a maximize button. Again, one click will enable it to take up the whole screen. If you click the minimize button, it's because you want to tidy Excel away for a moment. You don't want to close it, you just want to tidy it away down to the taskbar at the bottom of the screen. And there we can see down at the bottom our taskbar with Excel still open and running, just minimized away. So let's click back once on that to bring it back. Now, one tip that I would give you, if you've opened Excel and your screen's matching mine, it doesn't look particularly user-friendly at the moment. Across the top of the screen, we've got File, Home, Insert, Draw, etc. My first tip to you would be to do the following. Click on Home, and when you click on Home, or in fact any of the words across the top there, it generates what's called the ribbon. The ribbon contains all the buttons for everything we want to do in Excel. But rather than it popping up when we need it, I personally would recommend that you have it there all of the time. So to pin it in place, I'm going to move my mouse pointer to the far right hand side of the screen, and you can just make out there's a little icon, a little pin. If I click that, I've now permanently pinned my ribbon in place. That is what I would advise that you do. It makes it much more user-friendly. So now we can complete our tour of Excel and the interface. So if I click on File, the ribbon disappears because this takes you into what's called Backstage View. Here you can open files, you can save your changes to your work, you can save an existing file as a different file, and you can print. I'm not going to go through all these options now because I don't want to bore you. Okay, we'll come back and look at some of them in more detail later on. But please note that when you click on File, it takes you into an area where you don't have access to the ribbons. To get back to our actual working spreadsheet, click on the back arrow in the top left-hand corner, and that takes you back to your Excel workbook. So let's continue looking at the rest of the Excel screen. Home, Insert, Draw, Page Layout, and so on. This whole area is called the ribbon. The ribbon consists of tabs. The Home is a tab, Insert is a tab, Draw is a tab. The Home tab is where you will spend most of your time, and particularly on this course, we really don't need to leave home very often at all. With every single ribbon, the ribbon is organised into groups. So for example, with the Home ribbon, the first group is the Clipboard group. You can see the word Clipboard at the bottom there. We have the Font group, where we'll be coming to make our formatting changes later on, the Alignment group, the Number group, and so on. Now, the icons are arranged in a particular group according to what you want to do. So for example, everything we need to do with regards to formatting fonts, you can generally find as an icon here on the Font group. And what's really useful is that when you hover on buttons in a particular group, a little prompt appears that tells you what that button does. And quite often as well, as in the example here with the italics button, you'll see a keyboard shortcut appear as well. So Control and I is our equivalent to clicking Italics button on the keyboard. We can press Control and I instead. But again, I'll be focusing on that more later on. What I do want to bring your attention to, however, is this little arrow in the bottom left-hand corner. Now you'll see this in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see this in the corner of some groups, but not all groups. If you see this button, it's telling you that there are more options available, but they just couldn't fit them all on the ribbon. It's called the Dialog Box Launcher, and when you click on that button, it opens up a dialog box that gives you every single option possible. Everything that you can do, for example, with regards to formatting fonts, you can see here. So using this as an example, we aren't given buttons up here in the ribbon for strike through, which crosses out your text, and superscript and subscript. But again, I will talk more about these later on. If ever you make changes in here, you would need to click OK to accept them. For now, I'm going to click on cancel because I haven't made any changes. So please remember these terms. We have the Home tab, the Home ribbon. The ribbon consists of groups, and in the right-hand corner of some groups, you have a Dialog Box Launcher, which gives you additional options available. Now, a word of warning, and some people on training courses I run do come across this issue. As they're clicking here, there and everywhere, they accidentally click on the tiny little upward pointing arrow in the far bottom right-hand corner of the ribbon. As you can see, when I hover here, it tells me that this button will collapse the ribbon. Let me show you what happens if I click on that. So one click and the ribbon disappears. At this stage, people often panic and think, where have all my icons gone? I can't carry on working. All you need to do is click back on one of the tabs, Home, Insert, Draw, something along those lines, and your ribbon will reappear. But do be careful. If you do not go and pin it, as I did earlier on in the corner, if you just click back into your workbook, the ribbon will again disappear. The idea behind this is that the ribbon is only on the screen when you need to use it. But again, as I said earlier on, I would recommend, and this is how I work, pinning the ribbon. So I click on Home one more time, I go to the very, very end of the ribbon and I click on the pin to pin the ribbon in place. So, we've had a look at the ribbon. It's a fantastic tool, very easy to use. If you're unsure what a button does, you can hover and that prompt will appear to tell you. However, there are certain jobs that we do a lot in Excel, and we can create shortcuts of our own to help us work more efficiently and to do these jobs quicker. These shortcuts can be stored on this tiny little toolbar here at the top left-hand corner of the screen above the ribbon. Now, when you first buy Microsoft Excel off the shelf, it comes with the buttons that you can see here. So the first button is Save, for saving changes. We have Undo, for undoing mistakes. Obviously, I haven't done anything at the moment, so I can't undo. The same applies to Redo, and I'll talk more about those two later on. If you use a notepad at all, you can work with touch mouse mode so that you can use your fingers on your screen. This isn't going to be applicable for this session. But if you notice at the end of this toolbar, a little downward pointing arrow allows us to customize this quick access toolbar, and I would highly recommend that you look at adding some of the buttons that you're going to be using regularly. Now at this stage you're probably not sure, so let me give you some pointers. So one click on the customize button, and I would recommend that we add the new shortcut. A piece of paper now appears on the quick access toolbar, and this means that from this point onwards, whenever we want to create a brand new blank workbook, all we have to do is click on this piece of paper. If that piece of paper isn't there, well, your option involves going to File, New, and Blank Workbook. Now, I know I may seem a bit lazy, but that's 3 clicks. I'd much rather do 1. So let's go back using the back arrow. Now with 1 click, we can create a new document. There we go. You can see up in the title bar, it calls it Book 2. That's our second document. Other buttons I'd recommend that you add to the quick access toolbar. Well, open. You open files a lot in Excel, so definitely add the open shortcut. And email is a really good one to add as well. If you regularly email your work to other people, you don't need to bother saving your changes in Excel and closing it and then going into Outlook and creating a new email and clicking on the attachment icon. All you need to do is one click on this button here and it instantly puts it into an email for you as an attachment. Other buttons that I'd add as well. I wouldn't add quick print, not for Excel, because 99% of the time you need to make changes in print preview before you print. So let's add print preview and print as our next button. And the last one that I would add from there is spelling. Now, it may well be that as you work more and more with Excel, you think, well, there's other buttons that I'd like to add, but they're not in that list. Where can I go to find them? Well, if we move down to the bottom of the list, and as I do that, since I'm not going to be using touch mouse mode, I'm just going to turn that off. So let's click back on the customize arrow again, back to the bottom of the list, and guess what? More commands. That's where you need to go if you want to add any shortcuts to your quick access toolbar that aren't in the list above. When I click on more commands, it actually takes me into Excel options. And down here in the list on the left, you can see it's already highlighted the quick access toolbar. So over on the right hand side, we're looking at a list of commands. You can see as I scroll up and down, there's various buttons for various jobs that we can do in Excel. For example, inserting columns, inserting rows. However, this list doesn't look very long, and there's a reason for that. At the moment, this list is only showing us popular commands, not all commands. So in order to change that, we have to go up to popular commands at the top of this box, click on popular commands, and click all commands from that drop-down list. Once you've chosen all commands, you can see that the list underneath is much, much longer because you are now looking at every single command for every single thing that you can do in Excel. And they're in alphabetical order, which is quite useful. For example, if I know I want to look for the close button to add that as a shortcut, I can click once on any item in that list, press the letter C on the keyboard. It takes me down to all the options that begin with C. I then just have to scroll down until I find close, which is, it's coming. There we go. Now there's various options available there. The one that I would recommend you use is close file. So we need to add that to our quick access toolbar. And in the middle, we've got the add button to do that. Now before I accept my changes here to my shortcuts, I would recommend that you change the order of your icons here to put them in a more logical order based on how you're going to use them. And again, my personal advice would be to have the new file button at the top. So we click once on new file and then over to the right hand side, we click move up, move up, move up to make that the first button on our quick access toolbar. I would then recommend having open as the second button. If you wish to move buttons down, you can see we have a move down option as well. And if you wish to remove a button because you no longer want to use it, then you can highlight the button and click remove, and that will remove it from your quick access toolbar. I'm really happy though with the buttons that I've got there, so I'm going to keep them as they are, and then I'm going to click on OK at the bottom in order to accept that. So glancing up at the top, I've now got some great shortcuts which will help me work much more efficiently and much more simply with some of the common tasks that I perform in Excel. New, open, save, and so on. So we're still getting to know the Excel interface here. Just to summarise, you've learned that this bar at the top is called the title bar with the name of the product and the name of the book that we're in. You've learned that we can minimise the workbook, minimise Excel down to the taskbar at the bottom. We can make it medium-sized. We can close Excel or the workbook. You've also learnt that this main area of graphics across the top of the screen is called the ribbon. Each ribbon has a tab as the header, and within that tabbed area you have groups, and each group contains a set of related buttons for that particular group topic. But as I said earlier on, really practically all of your time will be spent under the Home tab. Don't forget that File, however, takes you into Backstage View. And don't panic when you think you've lost your work, you haven't lost it. You just need to click the back arrow to take you back to your workbook and to the ribbons. Now, for the rest of the tour of the screen, I really need to have something open to show you. So I'm going to click on my Open button that I've added to my Quick Access toolbar. Remember, if you haven't added this, you would need to click File, Open instead. Having clicked on the Open button, I now need to, from the Open listing, choose where to go to look for the file that I wish to open. So in this example, I'm going to go to Browse in order to locate my spreadsheet that I wish to open for you. On the left-hand side, it enables me to browse the contents of my computer. It could be the item I'm opening is on the desktop, or it could be that the item I'm opening is in Documents, which is the most common area for storing work in Microsoft Office. It's under the heading of this PC. Having selected Documents on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to a folder that I've called Demo Files, and I'm going to double-click to open that folder up. And here's a list of files that I've prepared ahead of this course in order to help me teach you. So the file that I wish to open is called Large Spreadsheet. They're in alphabetical order. So I can either do one click on Large Spreadsheet and then click Open, or alternatively, I can double click on Large Spreadsheet and that will open that file for me. So here's your first exposure to some data in Excel, and this data enables me to carry on with my tour of the screen. Now, underneath the ribbon, you have the very first item you'll see is called the name box. When I hover on it, you can see it's calling it the name box. The prompt tells us that. And at the moment, it says A1 in there. Well, that's because I am clicked in cell A1. Where does all that information come from? Well, every worksheet in Excel consists of columns. Column A, column B, column C, and so on. There are thousands of columns, so you should never run out of space. And each worksheet in Excel is also made up of lots of rows. We can see here row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, and so on. There are millions of rows in Excel, in an Excel worksheet, so again, you should not run out of space. But let's talk more about the name box. Why does it say A1? Well, the current active cell, the cell that is clicked on, is A1. If I move across and click on Jan, which is in column B, row 2, you can see that now in the name box it tells me B2 because that's the cell that I'm clicked on. So that's what the name box does. It lets you, well, it tells you rather, the reference of the cell that you have clicked on. It's the reference of what we call the active cell. Now, we won't really be using the name box very much on this course, but should you ever subscribe to the intermediate or advanced courses, we use the name box a lot more then. Now, to the right of the name box, you have got a very important area of Excel called the formula bar. At the moment, the formula bar has got one of the salespeople's names in, D. Newell. And that's because D. Newell is the contents for cell A4. If I click on A3, the contents of that cell is chocolate sales. Again, we can see this in the formula bar here. If I click on any of the black numbers, you can see that number has been typed. We can see that in the formula bar. In this example here, 2195.19, I've actually typed that in. But if I ever click on a number and look up at the formula bar and see something beginning with equals, that is a calculation. That has not been typed in as that number. That answer has been generated through performing some sort of calculation in Excel. In this example, it's summing up the contents of cell B6 to D6. You're going to be learning how to do that shortly. So the formula bar is something we'll be focusing on more later on. So underneath the formula bar, you've got your column headings. A goes all the way through to XFD, as you can see at the end there. So you can see you will not run out of columns. I'd be hugely surprised if you ever did. And to see the number of rows we've got in Excel, if I just jump down here, you can see we've got over 1 million rows there. So again, you should never run out of space. And take me back to the start again. Okay, so over to the right hand side of the screen, you've got your scroll bar. This enables you to move up and down. At the top and the bottom are 2 arrows. You can either keep clicking on them repeatedly to move you down through the worksheet, or alternatively you can click and hold to move faster, or you can grab the rule, the slide rule in between those 2 arrows and click and drag it up and down in order to move up and down your worksheet. There is also a scroll bar running across the bottom of the worksheet. You can see here across the bottom of the screen. This enables us to move left and right. And again, we can either use the arrows or we can click and drag the sliding rule in order to release at a certain position. To the left of that horizontal scroll bar, we can see various sheet tabs, sheet 1, sheet 2, and so on. Now it's important to remember here some of these terms. A workbook is a collection of sheet tabs. So this particular file that's called large spreadsheet, this is a workbook and it consists of 12 tabs, numbered sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3 and sheet 4. Each of these is called a worksheet. By the way, I've typed at the top of each of them, this is sheet 4, this is sheet 3 and so on. That doesn't normally come with Excel. So we have a workbook which consists of worksheets, and a worksheet consists of columns and rows, and where a column intersects with a row we call that a cell. So these are terms that I'm going to be using throughout this course, so it's important that you understand them fully at this point. So back down, we've nearly finished our tour of the screen. To the left of sheet 1, you will see 2 arrows pointing to the left and the right. Each time you click on the right arrow, you will nudge across to see the next sheet along. So now it's sort of hidden sheet 1 from my view. I'm looking at sheet 2 through to sheet 12. There are no more sheets after sheet 12, which is why I can't click to nudge along any further. Okay, if I click the left arrow, now I can bring sheet 1 back into view. Now you may have well also noticed a rather useful prompt popping up as I hovered on those arrows in the bottom corner. It tells me that I can hold Control and press the left click. So that's Control in the bottom left hand corner of your keyboard. It's got CTRL written on it. So if I hold Control down and press the left click button, I quickly jump to the last sheet in the book. Another tip it's giving us there is if I right click, that enables me to quickly jump to any sheet that I may have within that workbook. So I select sheet 10, click on OK, and it instantly takes me to sheet 10. Now from my experience, if you work with a particular workbook that has lots and lots of sheets in it, that's a very useful tip. Right click on the arrows, choose the sheet you want to, and then either double click or click OK. And we're back to sheet 1. Now lastly, the last item of the Excel interface is across the bottom here. Now it doesn't look very exciting, it just looks like a very plain grey bar, but it's actually quite important. It's called the status bar. Rather interestingly, it's saying, are we ready? Yes, we are ready, we're in ready mode. But there's other times that this can become useful as well. If you wish to make any changes with regards to what's displayed in the status bar, if you press your right mouse button, a list of options will appear. So for example, if you want to turn your zoom on and off, you can do so by clicking zoom in this list. I don't wish to make any choices from this list, so I'm going to move away from it, back to the status bar and press my left click button to ensure the list disappears without me making any choices. We will be looking at that a little bit more later on, particularly when we look at calculations, because there's some very useful things you can do with that. Okay, so So moving along to the far right hand side of the status bar, we can see that the very first button is pressed in. It's the darker shade of grey. And when we hover on it, it comes up with the prompt normal. This is normal view in Excel. The view we're working in here and we're looking at here is the view that I would say most people work in. The second button along is page layout view. Let's look at what happens when I click on that. You can see the view of the screen has changed significantly. It's almost like you're looking at a Word document. You're seeing the physical edges of the page. This is how they would look like if you print them. So in this example here, we can see that columns A to G, this is how this data would look on page 1. Whereas June across to December, this is what our page 2 would look like. Now, it's important for me to impress at this point that you can work in this view. You can enter data in this view, you can format data in this view with bold, italic, underline, you can do calculations in this view. However, it's just down to personal preference. We will be returning here towards the very end of the course when we look at adding headers and footers, for example, page numbers and company logos. However, for now, I'm going to recommend that we return to the very first button, which is normal view. As I said, in my experience, this is the view that most people are confident with. One thing to point out at this point, you may now be aware that there are dotted lines in your view that you didn't have there before. For example, if you can just make out in between columns G and H, there are dotted lines running down in between those two columns, as is also the case in between columns P and Q. This represents the natural page break. That's appeared because of us switching to page layout view. Now that we've come back to normal view, it's showing us physically what will fit on page 1, so that's columns A to G, and then page 2, columns H to P, and page 3 would be columns Q and R. So don't worry, you can ignore them. It's just telling you that that's what's going to fit on each page. Back down to the bottom right hand corner again, and next to page break preview, next to page layout, you have a button called page break preview. Let's click once on this to see what happens here. Now, when you click on this button, it gives you a visual idea again as to what will appear on each page, and it's rather nice because you can see in quite a dark grey font here, page 1, page 2, and it is over here, but it's very small, page 3. So this enables us to see where our page breaks will physically sit. We will be returning to this view later on because this is one really handy way of adjusting where your page breaks sit. In other words, if you want to change what appears on pages 1, 2 and 3, you can do here by clicking and dragging the vertical blue lines. But I'm going to come back to that later on. So back to the first of those 3 buttons and normal view. So the last rather important element next to those 3 buttons is our zoom bar. This gives us the opportunity to zoom in or zoom out on our work. It won't print bigger or smaller, it's just going to make it easier for us to see or get an idea of how our spreadsheet looks altogether. So there's different ways of working with this. Each time you click on the plus, you're zooming in. It becomes easier to see the typing on the screen. Of course, you may wish to use your scroll bar to move up and down accordingly. And for those of you with a mouse, whereby you have a wheel on your mouse, you can use the wheel to scroll up and down too, and that's what I'm doing right now. Okay. Back to the zoom bar down in the bottom corner. If I click on the minus sign at the start of the zoom bar, I'm zooming out. Be careful, because if you click and hold, it happens very quickly, and before you know it, your screen can change so that your data becomes so small it's impossible to see. So one way of quickly remedying this is to click in the middle of the zoom bar, and that will bring it back to a pretty decent zoom percentage, I would say. Here it's telling us it's 112%. Now again, you'll notice that when I'm hovering on that 112%, it changes colour, and that's an invitation to us to click on it. The minute we click on it, over to the left-hand side of our screen, we are presented with the zoom box. Now I'm going to move this into the middle by clicking and dragging with my mouse. And this is a way that you can, if you wish, choose an instant magnification percentage. So if I know I want 75%, I can choose 75 and OK, and that's the percentage it gives you. If I'm really honest with you, however, I don't use that button in the bottom right hand corner to zoom in. I'm a little bit of a fan of holding Control on the keyboard. Remember, that's the CTRL key in the bottom left hand corner. And then I like to scroll the wheel of my mouse. That is a really quick and efficient way of scrolling in and out. You scroll one way, it zooms you in. Scroll the other way, it zooms you out. So that's my tip for zooming in and out in Excel. Hold Control and scroll. And in fact, please remember this, it doesn't just work in Excel. It works in all Microsoft Office products, and it even works on the internet as well. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at navigating around the worksheet and the workbook. There's going to be a little bit of revision here because I have already covered some of these topics with you, but it's not going to do any harm to make sure that you're really confident and comfortable moving around the sheets within an Excel workbook. So let me just increase the magnification to make it a little bit more realistic. I personally wouldn't work with my data quite so small. I would zoom in a little bit more. So I'm going to hold Control and scroll to zoom. So I'm scrolling the wheel of my mouse to move in. And then in order to get to the top of the worksheet, well, we can use the scroll bar on the right hand side to scroll all the way to the top. And we can use the horizontal scroll bar down at the bottom to scroll all the way to the left. So if I want to get to cell A1, I then click on cell A1. I've moved my cursor to cell A1. This is now the active cell. So moving around a worksheet, you can just click with your mouse. If I wish to go to cell A4, I can click on A4. If I wish to go to cell D3, I can click on D3. So you can use your mouse to move around just by clicking. Alternatively, you can use the arrows on your keyboard. So now if you look down at your keyboard, you should be able to locate a set of 4 arrows, up, down, left and right. Once you've located those arrows, you'll notice that each time you press the down arrow, it moves you down a cell at a time. The up arrow does the same, obviously moving up. The left arrow moves us to the left a cell at a time, and the right arrow moves us to the right a cell at a time. So we can use the arrows as well to move around. However, it can be quite laborious pressing left, 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 or holding the left arrow down, or grabbing your mouse in order to move to a certain section of your spreadsheet that you can't see at the moment. So for example, if I wanted to go to the bottom of my data in column A, if I'm to use the mouse, I could scroll until I can see the data at the bottom, and then I could click where I wish to position my cursor, in this example A40. However, that is quite slow. The process of scrolling to look for that location to then click in it can be quite time consuming. In the same way, moving across to the right hand side of the spreadsheet. Now we can't use our wheel on our mouse for this. We need to come and use the scroll bar down at the bottom. So I can click and drag the rule to move across to the right, but if I need to go further along, I then need to use the arrow by clicking and holding in order to move me further across. Again, this is quite time consuming. So I'm now going to share some tips with you, quick ways of moving around the Excel worksheet. So the first tip I'd like to share with you, and they all involve, by the way, using the keyboard. They're all keyboard shortcuts, and they will massively improve the speed at which you move around in Excel. So somewhere near your arrow keys, you should be able to find a set of keys that are labelled as follows: Home, Page Up, Page Down, End, and possibly Insert and Deleter in that group as well. If I hold down the Control key and press Home on the keyboard, that quickly takes me to cell A1. It will always do that. In the same way, if I hold Control on the keyboard and press the End key, it will always take me down to the last piece of data in that worksheet. As you can see here, it's taken me down to R38. So Control Home and Control End are very, very quick ways of moving to the start and the end of something. And again, please remember these when you're working in other Microsoft products. They work in all of them, okay? So Word, PowerPoint, Outlook, feel free to try them all out there. Now, what about Home and End on their own? Do they do anything? Well, to give you an example of that, I'm going to click in cell F6. We can see that's the active cell because it's now got this green border around it. Now let's imagine that I'm clicked here and I want to quickly get to the start of that row. If I press Home, voila, I'm quickly at the start of that row. However, End does not do the same thing. Now, if you're in Word or in an email, it would take you to the end of that line that you're in. But in Excel, End by itself does not take you to the end of the line. If, however, you press End followed by Enter very quickly, it takes you to the end of that line. Now, it hasn't happened here. There's a bit of a knack to this, I have to be honest with you. Oh, second time lucky. Now it's worked. Now, to give you my honest opinion on this, I wouldn't recommend that you use End with Enter because it's quite tricky to get it to work. Let me show you what I would use instead. So, to get back to the start of this row, what can I press on the keyboard? Home. So what I would do instead to get to the end of the row is I would do the following. Well, we know the right arrow takes us along a cell at a time. So guess what? If you hold Control and press the right arrow, you are at the end of that chunk of data. Now, it's worth me mentioning at this point that if there were any empty cells in this row, Control and the right arrow would have stopped me after each of those empty cells. But I still am a fan of this shortcut because it's still much quicker than using the arrows by themselves or trying to fight with End and Enter. So once again, Home takes me to the start of a row and then Control and the right arrow will take me to the end. So guess what? Control and the left arrow will take me to the start of that chunk of data. Now, looking down this column, column A, you will see that I have got no gaps in between chocolate sales, and whilst you can't see it, there are no gaps between any of the items listed in column A. So that means that if I hold Control and press the down arrow key, it's quickly taken me down to the last entry in that chunk of data. If I now press Control and the up arrow key, it takes me to chocolate sales. If I press Control and the up arrow key again, it's taken me to sales results 2016. And so now you can understand there's a gap in between those two. So Control and the arrow keys quickly move you from chunk to chunk of data, stopping whenever it encounters a gap. They're the shortcuts that I use. I find them very, very useful. So we've looked at, to summarise on the keyboard, we've looked at using the arrow keys to move left and right, up and down. You've learnt how, by combining them with Control, it enables you to move to the end of a series of data, whether it's left, right, up or down. You've learnt that Control Home quickly takes you to the start, A1 in this example. Control End quickly takes you to the end. So what other shortcuts are available? Well, if, for example, we press Control G, G stands for Go To, it brings up the Go To box. Now again, to be honest, I don't use this massively because it's asking for us to enter a reference. You can see the cursors flashing away there in the reference box. So for example, if I type M25 and press enter or click on OK, it's taken me to cell M25. You can see down here at the bottom, that's the active cell. It's got the green surround, which tells us so. But to be honest, how often do we know that we want to go to a certain column and a certain row, a certain cell? It's very rare. So that's why I don't use Control G particularly often. So let's do Control Home to bring us back to the start. So that's moving around a worksheet. I would recommend you use the keyboard shortcuts, but please do remember you can use your mouse with the scroll bars or the wheel of your mouse as well to move up and down and click wherever you wish to start typing or amend the contents of a cell. Earlier on, I explained how you can move from sheet to sheet by clicking on the sheet tabs along the bottom. I also explained how you can use the arrows in the bottom left-hand corner in order to quickly go to a particular sheet. For example, you can right-click, so you press your right mouse button on those arrows and then double-click on the sheet you wish to go to. So these are the options available for moving from sheet to sheet. If again, however, let's consider this scenario, your mouse has broken and you desperately need to move to sheet 2 or sheet 3 or sheet 4, how can you do that? Well, hopefully now you know where page up and page down are on the keyboard. So guess what? Let's hold Control and press page down to take us to sheet 2. Control page down again, sheet 3, and so on. Each time we hold Control, just repeatedly pressing page down. I'm still holding Control down and now I'm pressing page up, and you can see it's moving me back sheet by sheet until I get back to sheet 1. So that's how you can use the keyboard to move from sheet to sheet if you wish. So that concludes the section on navigating around your worksheet and your workbook. One thing that I will just mention, it may never happen to you, but just in case it does, I like to consider all possible scenarios here. If you ever go up to your name box up in the top left-hand corner and click there and type, for example, M20 and press enter, that's another way of going to a specific cell. You can now see it's taken me across to column M. I can see that I have been taken there because the M is a slightly different shade of grey to columns L and N. You can also see that I'm on row 20 because, again, looking at the row headings on the left-hand side, the 20 is slightly darker as a shade of grey than the 19 and 21. And we can see that M20 is our active cell with our green border around the side of it. So the name box, you may wish to use that, but just be warned that that's what will happen. If you, for example, now typed A1 in there and press enter, that may be useful if you forget Control Home, but I hope that you won't. So that concludes the section on navigating around the worksheet and workbook. Please do practice these skills. They will save you lots of time and frustration as you work more and more with Excel. The next section we're going to look at, again, it's really important to get to grips with this and make sure you're comfortable with it because you're going to be doing it a lot in Excel. It involves selecting data. We spend a lot of time selecting data in Excel because we want to change the look of it, we want to move it, we want to delete it. So let's make sure we're comfortable with selecting data. So again, I'm going to focus on the mouse first of all. As you move your mouse pointer around your Excel sheet, you will see that the mouse pointer adopts the shape of a white cross, quite a chunky white cross. This means that when you click on a cell, you will select that cell. If you wish to select several cells, it's really important that you still maintain that chunky white cross in the middle of the first cell of the group, and then you click your left button, hold it down and drag across and or down to select a group of adjacent cells. Please don't worry when you look at your screen and you think, oh, hold on, why are all of the selected cells grey apart from the first one? Does that mean it's not selected? No, it doesn't. It is selected, but that's your starting point, your home cell. So it will not change colour to have a grey background like the other cells. But please, let me just demonstrate to you now. If I go up and click on the bold button up at the top of the screen in the font group, you can see, like all of the other cells, that cell has also become bold. Let me turn bold off again by clicking on that button. So selecting, it's really important that you have the chunky white cross. I see so many people encountering problems because they do not have the chunky white cross. So it may well be that you want to select a group of cells. It may well be that you want to select several groups of cells and they're not next to each other. So how can we do that? Well, having selected the first group, with your keyboard, hold down your Control key, the CTRL key that you're now becoming quite familiar with. Move your mouse pointer, the chunky white cross, over to an area where you'd like to select further cells, and still holding the Control key down, click and drag and then release when you have finished selecting the second area. I'm still holding my Control key down and I'm selecting multiple or one-click individual cells. Holding Control whilst clicking and dragging over cells in an Excel worksheet enables us to select non-adjacent cells. So now any action I perform will apply to all of those selected cells. For example, if I click on the bucket of paint up in the font group, it will make the background colour of all of those cells yellow. Okay, in order to undo the fill colour, to get rid of the yellow, whilst I could go back to the bucket of paint to do that, let's have a quick look at undo. I'll be touching on this more later on, but up on our quick access toolbar, we've got the arrow bending round to the left, which when we hover tells us that it will undo format cells. You can see there the keyboard shortcut, Control Z. To be honest, that's what I tend to use for undo in all the Microsoft products. Control and Z on the keyboard lets you undo your last action. So if I click once, you can see it's undone the action of making the cells have a yellow background. Now, whilst we're on the subject of undo, you can see that next to undo, you've got redo. That will bring the yellow back. Undo will remove it. So undo is a great way of undoing something that's just gone wrong or an action that you wish you hadn't performed. You can only undo the last items or up to the last 100 items. To see what those 100 actions rather were, you can click on the tiny arrow next to undo, and it's now listing in this drop down every single action that I have performed in this particular spreadsheet. So if I wanted to undo everything, let's say the last 3 actions I've done, I click on the third action and it will undo all of those. Okay, so you've got about 100 levels of undo in Excel, but just be warned, you can't undo everything. You cannot undo saving, you cannot undo opening, closing, you cannot undo certain elements of working with charts. So my tip would be to make sure when you're happy with what you've worked on to save your changes as you go along, because then you could always close it down without saving if it's all gone terribly wrong, and at least you know that you've saved up until a certain point. Okay, so moving back to selecting. So to summarise, we've looked at selecting one cell by just clicking on it with the chunky white cross, selecting multiple cells by clicking and dragging with the chunky white cross. Holding the Control key at the same time as you're performing that action lets you select non-adjacent cells. To remove that selection, just click anywhere on one particular cell and now just that one cell will be selected. If you wish to select a whole column, you go up to the column heading. So if you'll notice when I hover my chunky white cross up onto column heading B, it becomes a black downward pointing arrow. I click once, that column is now selected. And we'll look at that later for things like deleting columns, inserting columns and so on. If I wish to select multiple columns, I again move my mouse pointer up to the column heading. When I get the black downward pointing arrow, I click but I don't let go. Even though the black arrow is gone, you drag across and you are selecting multiple columns. Okay, if you hold Control, you can then move along, again using the column headers, clicking and dragging or picking out individual ones to select multiple columns. And that same principle applies to rows. So coming over to the left-hand side of the screen now, it may be that I wish to delete row 4. So if I click on the number 4 at the start of that row, you can see the whole row is selected. I've got a black arrow pointing towards the row. If I click and drag down, multiple rows are selected. Again, I can hold my Control key and either click or click and drag on the row headings on the left to select non-adjacent rows. Now there are occasions where you may wish to select the whole sheet, all of the millions of cells that are there. And to do that, you can click on the grey box that's above row number 1 and to the left of column header A. Clicking once there selects every single cell on the sheet. So that can save lots of time. So please don't think about clicking and dragging too much there. If you want to select everything, then just come up and click on the box in the top left-hand corner. So that's selecting using the mouse and a little bit of keyboard as well. We've been holding control down there. But before we leave selecting, many people prefer to use the keyboard when selecting. Now, personally, if I'm just selecting a smallish area and I can see it all in front of me, if I'm honest with you, I do use the mouse to click and drag like so. But we can come across problems when we're trying to select lots of data, some of which is out of our view. So for example, here, let's imagine that I want to select quite a lot of data in the January column. So I hover on the first cell, click and start dragging down. And if you're not careful, the whole screen can move very, very quickly and it feels like it's out of your control, and you end up with this sort of yo-yo effect where you're dragging up and dragging down to try and get the actual amount of data that you want, and it's very, very frustrating. And it's for that reason that lots of people love the following shortcuts that I'm going to share with you. So let me take us back to the start of this spreadsheet, Control Home, to go to A1. Now, earlier on you learnt about using the arrow keys to move up and down and left and right. Or just try holding the Shift key whilst you press the down arrow key. That allows you to select one cell at a time. If I go back up, it will deselect. If I press the right arrow key, I'm still holding Shift. That will move across to select the cells to the right, and the left arrow will deselect. So Shift and the arrow keys allow you to have controlled selection up, down, left and right. But if you know that you want to select everything in a particular chunk of Excel, in a particular range, if, for example, I click on chocolate sales, now I know I want to select everything, all the data in this particular column. So instead of holding Shift and pressing the down arrow until I get to the bottom, I can hold Control, Shift and press down. And very quickly, just like that, everything in that column, all of the text has been selected for me to format or delete or do whatever I want with it. Okay. In the same way, if I'm at the bottom on grand total, I can press Control and Shift on the keyboard and press the up arrow key. That will select everything from that point up to A3. It won't select beyond that because of that gap that's there. If I wanted it to select even further up, I would still just have to hold Control Shift and press the up arrow key once more. If I press Control Shift and the right arrow key, it's now selected everything there that I've typed because there were no gaps, there were no empty columns along the way. So Control Home to take me back to A1. Control Shift down stops after the first gap. Control Shift down again takes me to the bottom of that chunk because there are no gaps within that chunk. If I want to select just one column at a time, this time I don't hold Control, I just hold Shift and keep pressing the right arrow key. And that gives me controlled movement until I get to the column at which I wish to stop. These really are things that you need to practice, okay? But you only need to practice them a few times, and then before you know it, you'll remember them and you'll be using them all the time. So that's using the keyboard in order to select data in Excel. Okay, so that's the end of the section where we've looked at selecting data. I'd just like to look at how you can set up some default settings in Excel. So for example, it may well be that you work for an organisation where every time you click on your new workbook button, you would prefer to have the font as Arial instead of Calibri and size 12. It may also be that every time you create a new workbook, you would like to have 3 sheets given to you rather than just one. Another example is that you may need to check or change the default language setting that Excel or your computer is using. All these sorts of things need to be checked and, if necessary, modified in Excel options. In order to go to Excel options, you need to click on File to take you to Backstage View, down to Options at the bottom. And as you can see, there are lots of main headings on the left-hand side to do with language, data, saving. But underneath general, we can look at the subheadings available, and underneath, when creating new workbooks, we can choose, using the example I gave you, to have Arial as our new default font, and the font size is 12. And we know we want 3 sheets with each new workbook, so we can change that there too. Now, to check or possibly change the language that Excel is using, on the left-hand side we click Language, and from the languages listed, in this example we've got English United States and English United Kingdom. We need to just make sure, I would like to make sure that United Kingdom is the default, which it is. If you wanted to switch it to US, you would click on English United States, and over on the right hand side you would click Set as Default. But I'm quite happy with how it is for now, so I'm going to click on OK to accept my changes. Now, because these are global changes to Excel itself, it's saying we have to close and restart Excel so that these font changes can take effect. So OK, I shall do what I'm being asked. Now, something to bear in mind is that we've probably got 3 or 4 different Excel workbooks open here. Now, a way of checking that is to look down at the bottom of your screen to your taskbar. You can see the Excel icon down at the bottom, and in fact it looks slightly layered. That in itself indicates we've got multiple workbooks open. If I hover on the Excel icon, I can see I've got 5 workbooks open. I can quickly switch from one workbook to the other using these preview samples. But I've been told that I need to exit Excel altogether. Well, rather than going into each book and clicking on the cross in the top right hand corner to close it, a very quick way to close all of them is to come down to the Excel icon in the taskbar and press my right mouse button. And from that right click menu, I can choose to close all windows. Now, you don't have to panic here. It's going to ask me if I want to save changes to any of the books that are open as we go along. This is book 1 in front of me. I know I've done nothing in there. I do not want to keep it or save the changes, so I click Don't Save. And you could see in a flash there all of the other workbooks closed down. So let's go back into Excel using the search box and pressing Enter or clicking on Excel 2016. Okay, so lo and behold, we go back into Excel. We've created our new workbook, and look, the default font is Arial size 12, and down here at the bottom I'm getting 3 new sheets every time. So if ever you have any global changes that you need to make to the sort of engine room of Excel, that's where you need to look, File and Options. Now, to finish the Introduction to Excel section of this course, before we get started creating spreadsheets and working with formulas, let me tell you about Help. At the end of the ribbon, you can see you've got a little light bulb here saying, tell me what you want to do. And this is a great tool. I can click in here, and let's imagine that I want to add some numbers up. I can type add numbers. Now, if you want to go straight to Help and get examples and descriptions, then you need to come down to Get Help on Add Numbers at the bottom. From the sub-listing that appears, look for the most appropriate one, the one that's the closest match to what you want to do, and select it. This will take you to the online Microsoft Excel Help, which will give you lots of examples to work within your spreadsheets. It gives you clear descriptions. So here we can see summing up ways to add and count Excel data. It shows you the syntax of the formulas and functions there. You can go into more detail by looking at the bottom at simple addition and subtraction, adding values in a cell using a formula. So you can see here you're not left high and dry by Microsoft. There's lots and lots of help with pictorial examples to guide you on your way. But for today, you've got me. So let me close down this help section. And back once more to tell me what you want to do. I don't know if you spotted this, but when I typed add numbers, above Get Help on Add Numbers, there are various options. Now, we're not working with pens, we're not inserting cells, we're not dealing with headings, we are summing up numbers. Now, you're going to learn a lot more about this button shortly, but Help has evolved over the years into this great tool whereby you can actually use the button you're after there and there by finding it in help. So you can see here it's dropped in the function I need for adding up numbers. Now in this example, we're not going to be using it. So to come out of this cell without accepting anything, you can either press the escape key in the top left-hand corner of your keyboard. It has ESC written on it. Or alternatively, you can go to the start of the formula bar and click the red cross, which is your cancel button. Okay, so that concludes the introduction to Excel module of this course. To summarise, you've had a tour of the screen. You now know what I mean when I talk about the title bar, when I talk about closing a file, minimising a file. You know what I mean when I talk about the quick access toolbar. You're now familiar with adding buttons to the quick access toolbar. You understand what the ribbon is and how each ribbon has a different tabbed heading, and each ribbon consists of groups with related icons which relate to what you're trying to do within that font group or alignment group. If you can't find something you're after, you use the arrow in the corner for the Dialog Box Launcher, where everything that's possible lives. You've learnt about the formula bar, where we can see the contents of our cells. We can see whether numbers are numbers or the results of calculations. And you've learnt about the terminology with regards to columns, rows, cells, and how one workbook can consist of one or many sheets. You've learnt how to move around very efficiently within a workbook and on a worksheet. And similarly, you've learnt how to select data, either using the mouse, the keyboard, or a little of both, but doing it in a straightforward and efficient manner. So we're ready to move on to the next section, where we're actually going to get started on creating our first Excel workbook.